Okay, hello again to everyone. Thank you for being there in another session of the Reading Comprehension Regional Meeting. I'm Víctor Volman. I'm the director of the Observatorio Argentinos por la Educación. And we have the pleasure of having Andreas Schleicher, Director of Education and Skills for the OECD, to talk a little bit about the Latin America's opportunity to advance in reading comprehension. This Encuentro Regional 2025 of the Movimiento por la Comprensión Lectora. This is a virtual meeting that started, as you know, a week ago, that brings together key actors from Latin America to advance reading comprehension as a central education priority. We gathered so far ministers of education at the national and subnational levels, leaders from international organizations such as the World Bank, the IDB, UNICEF, CAF, UNESCO, scholars from different universities, governors, mayors, teachers, and funding organizations. This meeting is open to a broad audience, including educators, families, students, communicators, makers. And as I said, today's session is titled Latin America's Opportunity to Advance in Reading Comprehension. We're going to speak in English. Our goal is to reflect on what global evidence tells us about reading comprehension, what we have learned from PISA over the past 2 decades, and how this knowledge can inform better policies and practice in a region. So it's a great honor for me to welcome Mr. Andreas Schleicher. He is the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, and he is the man who started the program for international student assessment, PISA, as we know it. Andreas has worked for more than 20 years with education leaders around the world to improve quality and equity in education. His work has shaped how countries understand, how we all understand learning outcomes, including reading comprehension and also science, math, and how these results translate into evidence and into policy. So Andreas, thank you much for being with us today.
Thanks for hosting me, Victor. Looking forward.
Thank you, Andreas. So I wanted to start with a big question from the beginning, to start talking about the origins of PISA. This was, let's go back 25 years in 2000, if I'm correct, and you were involved in PISA from the very beginning. So my question is when PISA was first designed, what gap in global education knowledge were you hoping to fill, and how has that original mission evolved over the past 2 decades?
You know, if I think back to those years, the discussion on education was very much dominated by enrollment and spending. You know, the best education systems were the ones that had the largest share of the young people. Some were sitting in a classroom and were spending a lot of money on them. And, and we had very little of a dialogue on quality, and also actually very little in terms of peer learning. Countries were not looking to each other to learn from and with each other. And the idea of PISA really that we designed was to look at learning through the results that are being achieved. How capable are young people to understand the world, make sense of the world, read not just in a mechanical way, but use reading for learning. And in the same way, not just what they know in physics and chemistry, but can they think like a scientist? I think we wanted to sort of create a kind of global architecture where countries work together to frame what are the knowledge, skills, attitudes that matter for success. How can we define them together and then build the kind of framework to look at the results that are achieved? And as you can see from the results, it's actually quite, little relationship between enrollment and outcomes. There are some countries with very high enrollment rates where still the level of educational quality are quite low, where a large share of young people do not even reach what we call the baseline, literacy skills. And so I think that's what PISA really put attention to, how we can move from access to quality and from, content to relevance.
Okay, really, really interested. I think at that time you pushed forward the conversation about education. There were already some international assessments, such as TIMSS and PIRLS, predecessors of PISA, but they were more focused maybe on primary school. So the PISA test focused on 15-year-old children or young adults. And why was that decision made? Why did you decide that 15-year-old students were the target population?
And have they mastered that skills? The approach of PISA has been quite different. PISA does not ask, did you learn what you were taught? But PISA looks outward. Can you apply what you have learned? Can you extrapolate from what you know? Can you use your knowledge creatively in novel situations? So it was not designed around the common denominator of national curricula, but it was designed around what we call that concept of competence, the ability of young people to authoritatively use and apply their learning. That was the first difference. The second one was we try to assess students at a later age. We choose age 15 because that's the age when the world of work becomes real to people. Now, when school is getting towards the end and, the life after school, there should be awareness among young people. And that was very important for us to look at that transition point. To what extent are young people really prepared well for life after school? What you haven't learned at age 15, probably you're going to struggle with for the rest of your life. So that was important for us. And the third difference is really the policy context. When I worked for TIMSS, our audience were scientists, they were experts. We did not expect to influence public policy. And PISA was designed with that intent, actually. So it collected a lot of data on the context in which students learn, in which teachers teach, in which schools operate. And then, we were able to interpret the learning outcomes in the context of, a student, a school, and a country. And that was very important so that we could give policymakers some clues on, how students can learn better, how teachers teach better, and how schools systems can operate more effectively. So that contextual data is not a byproduct or an add-on to PISA, but it's very much integral to the design. So yes, assessments is not a novelty. Assessments have existed throughout, large parts of, the last century. But the idea they were used in a very, very different way, in a policy-oriented context, in a context that, looks at relevance, that places a great emphasis on the validity of the instruments in life settings. We're trying really in PISA to measure knowledge, skills, and attitudes that predict the success of young people in life, at work, and in society.
Interesting, Andreas. And looking back at more than 20 years of PISA, the last round was that we have results was in 2022. This started in 2000. What do you see as the most relevant or surprising or even counterintuitive lessons at a global level?
Yeah, I think the number of quite counterintuitive outcomes. I mean, the first thing is that, poverty is not destiny. You often think, well, kids from poor backgrounds will do badly in school. Well, that's certainly not the case when you look at this across systems. In 2012, we found that the 10% most disadvantaged young children in Shanghai, in China, were doing better than the 10% wealthiest in many, countries of Latin America. So again, poverty is not destiny. There is no, immutable link between the background from which students come and schools operate and the outcomes. And I think that's a really important finding, that we should not see this as a deterministic, but that public policy can do a lot to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms, to match resources with needs. That's the first thing. Another finding is that, money only gets you so far. The United States spends 10 times per student than Vietnam in purchasing power parities. And Vietnam gets the same results. So it tells you money is necessary, but it's not sufficient for success. And the same is true for student learning time. Some of the countries with the largest volume of learning time, think of Morocco, where students spend over 50 hours learning per week in school and through tutoring and so on. And still results are not so great. And then you look at Switzerland, they have, less than 30 hours per week, and they, have a high level of productivity. So again, it is counterintuitive. You always think, well, if I want to do better, I have to add more time. Not necessarily, focusing on the quality of learning environments can be a better bet. Some countries believe, migrants are a drag on their outcomes. I have more immigrants in my school systems, and therefore, they will lower performance. No, not necessarily so. You have countries where migrants, in fact, pull results upwards, or where, some countries have been very, very successful in integrating students with an immigrant background. And I think all of those are really encouraging insights. They show us that actually, it's not all given by the context, but education can just make such a huge difference. Education policy, no?
Great, Andreas. Interesting. And let's focus a little bit more on Latin America. You talked about some trends in the global education, comparing different educational systems. More than 80 education systems participate in PISA. But let's focus on Latin America, which at the very beginning, I think only 5 education systems were participating. And today, more than 15 education systems participate in PISA. So it's a region that grew a lot in the quantity of education systems that participate in PISA in every round. So what lessons from the Latin America results stand out to you? So are there any findings that challenge common assumptions about learning, about progress, about reform in the region?
Yeah, I think the first lesson really is that, just looking at results can make such a difference. I still remember the time, one day, very early on in PISA, we got a call from the president's office in Brazil, can we join PISA? And I was quite surprised. PISA was originally designed for, the countries of the OECD, which are all quite economically advanced. And then I received this call and I said, we will welcome the participation of Brazil. But I said, why would you do that? Your economy is less developed, so probably you find yourself pretty much at the end of the scale spectrum. It could, have a, public impact. And then I remember, the president saying, look, we're not stupid. We know where we are. But the problem is in my country, everybody thinks education is great. The kids get, all good marks. They're sitting for long hours in school. The parents find the school of their children better than the school they went there themselves. So there is nothing that will make us look upwards. Nothing which make us change. And so they did take part in PISA, and they did get the last place in the league tables. But it sparked a huge debate and discussion in Brazil. And actually, they were able to double the investment in education. If you speak to Fernando Haddad, now Minister of Economy, he used to be the Minister of Education in those days. He talks of a time before PISA and a time after PISA, how that awareness of, global education just, drove the education systems towards improvement, created that kind of public demand for better education. I think that's a really, really important lesson, because the tradition of many Latin American countries is that sort of education was a kind of story for the elite. If you have in a good context, you get a great school, maybe a private school, but this idea that education really needs to mobilize the talent of the whole community, of the whole society, that's actually quite foreign to the tradition. I mean, you see, it's the continent with the largest social disparity, and you can't just explain that with, income disparity. There are countries in Asia, that have as large income inequality as Latin America, but you don't see the education inequality. They still had that tradition, we need to give everybody a fair chance in education. And I think that's been something that PISA has brought awareness to in Latin America. I mean, we can see in countries like, Colombia, in Peru, in Brazil, real change in that, part of the distribution. That the lower end of the distribution has really moved up, that many of the countries have almost a majority of 15-year-olds that do not even reach that kind of what we call the baseline level of literacy. That level of literacy where you start to moving from technically being able to read to use reading for learning, where you can expand your horizon, where it becomes an empowering tool. Half of the young people do not reach that point in a world of artificial intelligence, where actually this exposes you to so dramatic risks. And I think that awareness that this can be different, I think, is one of the biggest, outcomes that I've seen really in many countries in Latin America. I think also the focus on teachers, that it's not just about having someone in the classroom, but that pedagogy matters, that curriculum design matters. That sometimes, teaching fewer things at greater depths can give you better results than crowding the curriculum with a lot of content. Another pattern that's interesting, I can't tell you why, but that's quite common across countries in Latin America, is that the education system very much focused on reproduction of subject matter content. Students learn a large volume of material and are quite capable in reproducing it in different contexts. But when you give them tasks where they have to extrapolate from what they know, use that knowledge creatively to solve complex problems, learn autonomously, show agency, show problem-solving skills, many of the students struggle. And I think there's lots of awareness of that now. You see really interesting approaches to curriculum design. I must say, again, I come back to the story of Brazil, because for me it's one of the most fascinating stories. It's a very large education system, and you have, something like the state of Ceará that, linked every high-performing school to a less performing school and leveraged the knowledge and experience of successful schools to help everybody advance. And I think that really has set a very important tone, that, equality of opportunity that, was always in the public discourse, but it wasn't really translating into educational reality. And I think that's changing.
Yes, and also it's changing thanks to having results, right? Because if we hadn't standardized tests such as PISA and others, we didn't have the information about it. We were just another person with an opinion, but we didn't have the facts to check if those results were being achieved or not. Going into reading comprehension, if we look at the countries that participate in PISA, the education systems, there's a group of champions of PISA. So Estonia, Singapore, Canada, Finland, let's say like the top 5 or top 10 educational systems consistently perform very well in across the subject, and specifically in reading comprehension. And from your perspective, what do these educational systems have in common? What are the key drivers? What are the lessons? What's behind their success in the reading comprehension results? What can we learn from them?
Yeah, I think the first thing that you can see is that they often do not treat reading as a kind of school subject. You just have to read a lot of volume of material, but reading is almost, a synonym for learning. That actually, if you go to Estonia, for example, in preschool, you do not have students being drilled to learn to read. You do not see that. Actually, the idea there is, let's build that curiosity for learning. Let's build the kind of building blocks for literacy and give that children that energy. And then they come into school and they're full of enthusiasm. They're actually, have learned to socialize. They've learned to, be self-disciplined, self-regulated. And they learn very rapidly. And at the age of 15, they demonstrate superior learning literacy skills. So I think this idea that literacy is really the foundation that enables us as humans to understand the world, to make sense out of things, to act in this world, to take on responsibility. I think you can see that very, very clearly. The second part is particularly literacy. Mathematics is more school-bound. You do not learn it on the street. But literacy is something that's very much linked to social processes. Early on, whether your parents read to you, whether there's an awareness that, a literature-rich environment matters, whether your teachers are really good at building, that motivation in you. Otherwise, it becomes an uphill struggle. Students, dislike to read, and the enjoyment of reading is one of the most powerful predictors. The high performers that you quoted all see great levels of student enjoyment for reading. Students do not just read for instrumental purposes. I have to read that document, but they like to read because they see that reading is, broadening their mind, broadening their horizon. So I think that's a really, really important part of it, more than, the specific pedagogical strategies that are then used in the classroom. You can see lots of variation on that. So a great emphasis on making this a whole of society enterprise, connecting parents, connecting schools. I'm always amazed how the East Asian countries, even in the most difficult circumstances, bring parents along. I was once, in a really poor, a neighborhood in Yunnan province in China, and I was so amazed how in that environment you see excellent reading skills among young people, and also great reading behavior. And I asked a teacher, how were you able to bring parents along with you on that when they couldn't read themselves? And the teacher said to me, well, I try to talk to every parent twice per week. And I said, you have 50 students in your class, you talk to every parent twice per week. That is an incredible workload. And she said to me, yeah, it is a lot of work, but if I wouldn't have all of these parents helping me, I could never do my job. So you can really see how reading was built as a kind of social activity. And I think that's a really, really important kind of point that PISA always highlights, how closely reading results and behaviors are interrelated. No?
Yes, and that makes me think about, you said the importance of society. This is not like improving literacy and reading skills is not only the work of governments, it's not only the work of international organizations, but also the effort of NGOs, of the community-based initiatives, how they play a role, of parents, of the families, both working directly with the learners or even supporting public policy through advocacy, through innovation. And in Latin America, we are building this movement for reading comprehension that now includes more than 400 organizations in the region. And from your perspective, how can the civil society effectively can contribute to improve the skills we need, the learning outcomes we need, particularly when we work alongside governments and international organizations? How can the civil society push these results up?
There's a very simple finding in PISA in all Latin American countries. If you look for one of the most powerful predictors of reading skills at the student level, is the number of books that you have at home. Of course, if you throw books into a children's room, nothing will change. That's not the point. But it's a symbol. It's a symbol how society values reading. And if children find books in a school library, if children find books at home, it means to them, there is value in treasuring knowledge. There is value in us accessing that knowledge and expanding that knowledge, contributing to that knowledge. It's not just, I need to know something and now I have to go to the trouble of reading, but it is something, that is what distinguishes us as humans, that we are conscious, that we can actually, expand our knowledge by our free will, that we're not just consumers of stuff. And so that's really, really important. And that's where society can make such a difference. It's the symbols and signals. If your parents read to you, if you have a good public library, if reading is present in our societies as a tool through which our culture is created and portrayed. I mean, not all of it, but a big part of our culture is created and also communicated. And I think that's a really, really important part. These days everybody talks about digital literacy now. And then in one of our last PISA assessment, we assessed digital literacy. And then we ask ourselves, what predicts digital literacy skills? And, your first thought is, oh, well, of course, the students who have more opportunity to read on a computer, they will have greater digital literacy skills. We didn't find that relation. In fact, it was often negative. The students that did best on digital literacy were students who had read books over 100 pages. They had read paper books over 100 pages. And you ask yourself, why? And we ask ourselves that question too, and we don't know the exact answer. But one hypothesis clearly is, if you read a book of fiction, you have to build a complex mental representation of things that you do not see in front of you. You have to imagine characters. You have to imagine their relationships. You have to build that, a world of imagination. And that's exactly what you need in the digital world, to make decisions, to navigate ambiguity, to manage complexity. If you just read in the digital world, you are much more likely to just absorb the content that is thrown at you. The marmalade that comes out of ChatGPT, you just consume that step by step. You do not have that cognitive activity. And I think that's what society can do. To convey, reading is about personal growth. Reading is about, expanding to new worlds and, connecting myself to other people, understanding how other people think in different cultures and different traditions. And I think that's the biggest contribution that society can make to this. And then, children, I think, will learn on their own, and young people will continue to learn reading throughout their lives. But if you haven't mastered those foundations, it's just a misery. It's just an effort you make to, get some, instrumental knowledge, and that is not enough. No.
Yes, you were talking about ChatGPT and digital literacy, and back in 2000, when all this started, reading literacy mainly referred to understanding printed text, to understanding books or stories. But now, by 2025, this includes also navigating digital environments, children using TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, social media, and evaluating online information, dealing with misinformation as well. So I wanted to ask you, how has PISA definition and assessment of reading evolved during these years to reflect these changes and what are the new challenges that this pose for educational systems and also for evaluating educational systems?
Yeah, if you look at the last 25 years, as you say, at the beginning, literacy was mainly about linear text. It's hard to imagine for us, but in the year 2000, we mainly read linear text, newspapers, books, things that were carefully curated. If you had a question, you could look it up in your school book and you could trust the answer to be true. What a nice world. No? Today, you look it up on, Google or ChatGPT, you get 100,000 answers for your question, and nobody's telling you what is right, what is wrong, what is true, and what is not true. So you can really see how the construct has shifted from, interpreting information to actually, navigating ambiguity, managing complexity. Hypertext has introduced a new dimension. Now you no longer, see one linear structure in front of you, but you have a complex representation of knowledge. You have to find your own way actively through this. So that's how PISA has evolved as well. It evolved from assessing linear text to hypertext to multiple text formats, the interaction about them. And now in the next generation, it looks at AI literacy. Now, it's a natural evolution. Again, can you make, ethical decisions? Can you understand complexity, distinguish fact from opinion? Those are no longer, sideshows or academic curiosities. They are what reading now is about. So you can see that history of literacy well reflected in the constructs that are being assessed in PISA. At the very same time, we try not to be distracted by the medium. I think that's a great risk, that sort of this idea of literacy gets lost and we just focus on the way in which it is communicated. We still are very interested to see to what extent can, young people reflect on information, triangulate, build relationships, understand, connections, all of those things, make responsible decisions. These are the constructs that are of enduring relevance, and they will, be even more relevant today than they may have been in the past. We try to focus on that. We use the medium simply to represent, the kind of literacy challenges to young people now.
You were talking some minutes ago about the efficient use of resources. As PISA shows, the relationship between per pupil investment or spending and education and learning outcomes is not linear. Of course, without money, we cannot assure good results, but up to a point. After that, more money does not guarantee better outcomes. So at the same time, we see some educational systems that have maybe the same per pupil spending, but they perform very differently, especially in Latin America. We have several examples of countries who are spending the same or sometimes even less than other country, but outperforms the first one. So what do you think governments can do to ensure better learning results of every dollar invested in education?
Let me focus on Latin America for a moment, because I think there are some really interesting lessons here. I think the first lesson really is, better align resources with needs. Like spending in many Latin American countries remains highly regressive. Even though the infrastructure may look very similar and the student-staff ratio may look very similar, students in disadvantaged areas have access to the less qualified teachers, the poorer education resources. So in quantity, it may look similar, but as soon as you look at aspects of quality, the quality of student-teacher relationships, the experience of teachers, you can see huge differences. The first thing really is, how do you attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? How you get the most capable leaders, principals into the most difficult schools? And I actually, again, the example of Ceará in Brazil is a very interesting one, leveraging the experience of well-advanced schools to support the education systems to become better. Now, it's, by the way, something, secret of Vietnam in education, of parts of China. They have a very strong tradition to better align resources with needs. That's, for me, the lesson number one. The lesson number two for Latin America is to have a much closer eye on productivity. Students spend long hours in classrooms, but they actually often learn relatively little. There's a lot of emphasis on the volume of content, on the time spent learning, but very little on students sort of being active learners. Students spend lots of time listening passively to what the teacher says. And our data show very clearly where you have a very strong passive relationship between the student and the teacher, where there is an opportunity for students to do things, not just learn things. You can see much better results. The scientific experiment that you remember from your school is the one that you did, not the 20 experiments your teacher talked about at once. So I think creating more active engagement of students, creating also a closer student-teacher relationship You know, in PISA, we ask one very simple question on the relationship, you know. If you come back 3 years from now to your school, do you believe your teachers will be excited to see you? And, you know, when the students say yes, then everything is okay. They're not getting stressed. They're not worried about the exam. They're actually very engaged, active learners. When the students say no, they are disengaged. They are just passive consumers, you know. You have such high dropout in Latin America still. Young people simply, you know, leaving school. And that's not because of economic reasons. Maybe for some, but not for the majority. We have data from PISA, actually. For the majority of the students that we tested outside the school environment, it was a lack of relevance. They say school has been a waste of time. You know, it doesn't relate to my current life. It doesn't relate to my future life. And I think that is where the resources get lost. The volume doesn't translate into the kind of experiences that energizes young people, that, you know, gives them that agency, that sense of self-efficacy. And I think that's something really, really important, to think about a resource utilization that puts much greater emphasis on the experience of learners, on the relevance of this, and on the quality of student-teacher relationships. I mean, you know, maybe it's a kind of not so fair for me to say this, but, you know, why did it take Latin America so long to reopen schools after the pandemic? You know, kids were kicked out of school for years. No, there was no need for that. It was not a health reason. It was because, you know, there was a lack of, you know, energy in the system, a lack of, you know, we are in this together and we have to make this work for the next generation. And I think that's something that is a bit of a symbol. No?
Yes, and speaking about the highly regressive systems we have in Latin America in terms of allocation of resources, I was thinking about this socioeconomic trap, because if we look at PISA results, of course, the relationship between socioeconomic status, if a children comes from a lower socioeconomic background, is a strong predictor of the student performance. But at the same time, it cannot be an excuse for us that we work in educational systems. If we cannot stop and say, okay, until the socioeconomic status goes up, we don't do anything. So based on PISA data, what can we learn? What can we do to help those children and have better results in education systems?
You know, this is one of the most powerful lessons from PISA. It's not about your individual social background. It's not the social background that comes from the family that you bring into the school that predicts these low outcomes. It's the aggregate social background of the school. The problem in many Latin American countries is not that there are students from poor families. The problem is that the situation of those students gets compounded in the school they enter. You know, they get together with many other disadvantaged children. They get together with an environment that is less qualified. They get actually confronted with lower expectations. One of the most, you know, poisoning aspects is when, you know, we give up the hope that every student can learn. When teachers have this idea, oh, you know, these are kids from disadvantaged background, we make things easier for them, we lower our expectations, our standard. That is how the impact of social background is created in Latin America. You have as many poor students in Vietnam, you know, or these students, poverty exists in every part of the world. The question is, you know, how our societies treat the most vulnerable members of society. And it's the aggregate context of the school in the case of Latin America, and not just the personal background.
Interesting. Let's look ahead a little bit. PISA last round was this year, 2025. The results will be launched next year, 2026. When will the next round of PISA take place? What can we expect in terms of new developments? And what can we see about other projects that you have from the OECD, such as PISA for Schools, PILA, or other assessments that maybe you want to talk about, such as TALIS and many others?
Yeah, you know, in 25, we are focusing very much on learning in the digital world. And an interesting new aspect that we introduced, that we're not looking just at whether students get the answer right to the test questions, but we very much look at how they answer those test questions. What kind of approach do they take to solving problems? What does this tell us about the pedagogy underpinning about learning? So that's a really new angle that we take for the first time in 25 to look at that. Another really interesting instrument that we have brought out, and we have Colombia and Brazil quite active in that, is our assessment of social and emotional skills. It's telling us another part of the story, not just the cognitive development, the literacy skills, the mathematical skills, but also to what extent do students develop, psychological strengths, emotional resilience, strong kind of community engagement. No? And there are some really interesting patterns in Latin America. You can say Peru still has a very long way to develop high academic standards, but you do see some really important social emotional qualities in Peru. And so we're trying to put greater emphasis on that to look more broadly at what it will take in this world of AI, in this 21st century, volatile, ambiguous world, what it takes for young people to be successful. And, some of the soft skills of the 20th century are becoming really hard skills in the 21st century. And, maybe some of the hard skills of the 20th century become quite soft. Technology takes them over. So we're trying to readjust it with some really interesting instruments. Then we have our PILA assessments, where we are bringing assessments into the classrooms. There's a lot of interest often among teachers. They like the kind of PISA approach, this applied complex reasoning approach. They say, but how can I do it in my own classroom? And that's where the PILA really gives interesting tools. We have the PISA for schools. Sometimes we get requests from individual schools. How do we come out on this assessment? Where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses? How do we compare with statistical neighbors, schools that look like us but achieve differently? So we have brought out a quite variety of instruments. The main change that you really see is a broadening of the outcomes, beyond cognitive outcomes, and at the same time also bringing the assessment closer to the front line, to make them more relevant to the school, to the environment, so that people can take action closer, not just at the level of government.
Thank you, Andreas. And when will be the next round of PISA?
After 25, it's going to be 29. That's
29.
And the emphasis will be very much on AI literacy, the kind of literacy. And climate literacy is also a very interesting new aspect that PISA is bringing in. To what extent, can young people take, see the connections between the present and the future? See that if you drink a cup of coffee in, Bogota, how it can affect, workers in Brazil and vice versa. And I think that kind of awareness is very important, and also how people understand the interaction between human activity and, the climate and what that means. So I think that's the kind of literacy that we should not forget, that, balance between living today and creating a better world tomorrow.
Great, Andreas. Thank you so much for these insights. So we had in this conversation, we highlighted the challenges for Latin America facing reading comprehension, but also we learned a lot about real opportunities around the globe to improve learning through evidence, collaboration, and commitment. Thank you special to you, Andreas, and your team, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope this discussion helps and contributes to strengthening policies, practices, partnerships that ensure that students in our region become strong, confident readers, and that we have good results, of course, in PISA in the next round. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Andreas, and thank you for being part of this special session. Bye-bye.
Gracias. Gracias. Thank you.